Good afternoon. This is Claudette Milner, host of A Matter of Interpretation. Today, my guest, Dr. Stephen Kniffley Jr. We're going to talk about two issues, mental health in Black teens, and we're also going to talk about his book, Knowledge of Self. This will be a part one and part two, and I dare you not to tune in for part two because both of them are exciting and interesting topics. Of course, before we meet our guests, we're going to go to God in prayer. Most gracious Father, we come to you just thanking you. We ask, dear God in heaven, that you show me your grace and your mercy. Give me wisdom in order to do this interview. Dear God in heaven, we thank you. Amen. Dr. Kniffley, if you will please introduce yourself to the listening audience and just tell a little bit about your background, and then we're going to dive right in.
Sure. So my name is Stephen Kniffley Jr. I'm an assistant professor at Spalding University in their School of Professional Psychology. I'm also the associate director for our Center for Behavioral Health at Spalding University and currently serve as our coordinator for our Collective Care Center, which is the only racial trauma center in the state of Kentucky, as well as the Midwest. I'm an author and a speaker, and also am a licensed board-certified child psychologist.
Okay. The first question I want to ask, and break this down any way you want to, I want to ask you why mental health care is stigmatized in the African American community, because I think if we don't get over the stigma, the interview stops right there in the minds of so many.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And some of the things that I think about that contribute to stigma for Black individuals are issues related to access, issues related to perception, and then issues related to coping. So in the West Louisville area specifically, there are 1,000 clinicians, but there are only 7 clinicians. So there are 1,000 clinicians in Louisville, but there are only 7 clinicians in West Louisville. And so already our access to mental health services is much, much less. Additionally, in the state of Kentucky, there are only 5% of psychologists that are persons of color. So if we think about how most people feel comfortable going to folks that look like them, we don't have that option. And then also we don't have access just like other people do in other ends of the city. So that's the access challenge. Another challenge is related to perception. So whenever I have Black clients come in and talk with me about mental health related issues, some of the first questions that they ask are you going to go tell my business to someone else? And where's your couch? You know, because they've been kind of influenced by popular culture to think that psychology and seeking out mental health services means that you're weak. It also means that they're going to do something weird to you, like make you lay on the couch and do all that type of stuff. Or they're going to go tell your business to other people. But one of the things I always tell folks is that there's some pretty stiff fines and penalties if I was to share any of your secrets with anybody else. So psychologists are the greatest secret keepers on the planet, in my humble opinion. Lastly is coping. So one of the challenges that we have is that we as a people have had to cope with some really tough things over the last 400 years. And so if you think about when slavery first started, there wasn't time to sit and process bad things that happened to people. You just had to put it in the back of your head and keep on moving. And so what has happened is, like, imagine it's like boxes. And all of us have boxes that have all the bad things that have happened to us. And we put those boxes in the attic. One of the challenges is that we never go back and look at what's in those boxes and process that. Instead, we just put those boxes away in the attic and never visit it again. Well, those boxes are always still there. And so what we then end up doing is just like passing those boxes down through the generations until we finally have someone in my generation that has all these boxes that all the other family members have been dealing with that I now have to deal with myself. And that can be really overwhelming. But I've been told oftentimes that I have to be able to deal with those boxes or it makes me weak. So issues related to access, issues related to coping, and issues related to perception of mental illness is what contributes to the stigma that we have.
I want to look at, it says that 20% are more likely, for African Americans, are more likely to experience some form of mental health issues.
Mhm.
And they kind of broke it down for me. And I want you to talk about each of these issues and the impact on Black teens, because I want to focus on Black
Sure.
teens.
Mhm.
Major depression.
Mhm.
How do you identify and what are the symptoms? If you have a Black male teen or a teen period,
Mhm.
and you're looking for major symptoms to figure out, when are you depressed for a day, or is your depression heightened by how you get through, a certain situation? So kind of give us what to look for.
Sure. So just thinking a little bit about what major depression is first. Major depression means that you have symptoms of sadness and feeling a lack of interest in things and all of that lasts at least 4 weeks or more. And you feel that way more often than not. And so if I'm looking at depression in teenagers, what I'm looking for is that lack of interest, is that sadness that one experiences more often than not. If I'm looking specifically at Black males, I'm looking more at irritability. So in our particular culture, it's not acceptable for Black males to be sad because of some of the things that go along with being sad. So being tearful, being moody, like all those types of things are not really associated with it's not acceptable if you are a Black male. Because the idea that if you cry a whole lot, then that means something about you and your masculinity. And so the way that we present that instead is through being irritable. So, going out and everything just kind of sets you off. You're easily frustrated about things. Sometimes you have issues with concentration. Those are some of the challenges that I'm looking for in addition to the sadness and lack of interest that occurs more often than not for at least 4 weeks or more is that irritability piece.
Okay, so I know that women don't like criers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, let's face it, let's be honest. Generally, if a man tears up at a romantic movie, if he's, just showing signs of, and typically that's showing signs of femininity,
Mm-hmm.
showing signs of weakness. How do we get around that?
Yeah.
How do we deal with those feelings of feeling like they're less masculine if they're crying all the time and boo-hooing?
Yeah, so I think we have to think about where does that come from. I believe strongly that we must be connected to our roots from an African-centered perspective. And in Africa, men are emotional. It's a part of their lived experience to show affection to one another, to their spouses, and to their children. And so the idea of not showing affection, of not being able to express your emotions is not consistent with our culture. And so that's one of the first things to think about. Another thing to think about is where did that come from here in America? And one of the challenges that we have to look at is in what ways does the media and popular culture influence us to think that being a man can only be expressed in one way. And so that's kind of another thing to think about. And then the last thing to consider is the cost of that. So we all have to show emotion. It's a part of who we are as people. And when we are unable to show one side of our emotional experience, that heightens the other part. So if I can't tell you that I'm sad and show you that through tears, I'm going to tell you that I'm sad through my fist and through anger. And so there's a cost associated with that. So we have to think that showing emotion is a part of our culture. We are an emotional people. It's consistent with our lived experience in Africa. We have to think about how popular culture has influenced us to think a certain way about what it means to be a man. And then we also have to consider what's the cost if we say that being a man can only be expressed in one way.
Okay. Because we're listening more importantly to the last one.
Mm-hmm.
That if you can't cry, then you might hit.
Mm-hmm.
So that sticks more with women than the alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, I like to be real.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So that's what we heard.
Yeah.
I want to look at ADHD because we hear it every single day. I mean, it used to be, it's a lot better. It used to be when I first started tutoring that parents would bring their kids in and they would be on meds and they would be focused, and then sometimes they'd be almost knocked out to where they were not. It's gotten better. But explain what ADHD is, and so many parents, it's either you're on one side or the other. No, my child can possibly have ADHD, he's just a little bit hyper. And then you have the other extreme that medicate my child because I'm sure I Googled it and it's ADHD. So educate us.
Sure. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And within that acronym, ADHD essentially means that a kid either has challenges with inattention, so challenges focusing, or sitting still, and impulsivity, which are the hyperactivity aspect of ADHD. ADHD has always been thought to be more of like a behavior issue, so a kid just can't keep themselves still and can't control themselves. But we've found that ADHD is actually an executive functioning challenge. And executive functioning is where the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain, which is where we have our reasoning and our ability to control ourselves and our ability to concentrate and to pay attention. Those where those skills lie. And in kids that have ADHD, there are deficits in those areas that can be easily measured through assessments that we conduct as psychologists. You are right that oftentimes ADHD is overdiagnosed, especially in Black kids. Sometimes it's seen as a management technique. So my kid is having trouble staying still, and so it must be because he or she has ADHD. But oftentimes we are pathologizing or turning something into a disease. Which is just normal kid behavior. I don't know if you've ever been around some kids, but all the kids that I've seen that are 5 and under, they just can't sit still. That's just a part of who they are as little people, is, just like doing things like that. I think it becomes more of a challenge when it comes outside of the normal range of what would be expected for a kid's behavior. And so if we think about it from an executive function issue, it impacts not only how they behave, but how they learn, how they relate to people interpersonally, their social skills challenges, like all those things are also impacted as well.
Okay, so how do you find out? Is this something you take to the school, because the school tries to identify it, and what happens sometimes, the schools will try to identify it. The first thing they do is say, we need to test your child. And immediately parents, for the most part, will say, is it going to stigmatize my child? How do we get around that?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is that we have to communicate to our kids that they are intersectional beings, which means that ADHD is just one part of who they are, not all of who they are. And I think it's in the way that you communicate it to your child. So if you say things like, oh, it's because you're ADHD, or you're ADHD, or something along those lines, and then that communicates to the kid that that's all they are. So if we just say, you are, kid, you are a kid that just happens to have ADHD, if you talk about it that way, then the kid's less likely to latch on to that label and think that's all they are. So that's kind of one way to get around the stigma associated with that particular label.
But the parent doesn't understand what it is. So do we not need to do a better job? Because as soon as you diagnose an African American child with something mental health related, the parent is going to say, my child has a hard enough time without them having in their file that they have a mental health issue. So, and the parent really doesn't understand what it is, and so for them it's one of those, it's one of those moments that they're having. The parent can't deal with it, so they can't explain it to the child, and because they can't explain it to the child, then both of them have that stigma attached. And I don't think we do any job of explaining to the parent, especially on a school level, that this does not define who your child is, that this is a part of an issue. So what can mental health clinicians do better to better educate the parent so that they in turn can put it on, explain it to their child in a way that it doesn't define them?
Sure. So if I can, I'll just walk you briefly through what our testing process looks like, and what the testing processes look like for me as an assessor in the past. So, and this will help explain one of the ways that we can help better explain ADHD and what it looks like. So when we are working with the kid, in the past, when I was on internship, the first thing that we would do is we would go to the parent's house. We would go to the parent's house and we would observe the kid in their natural environment. Because one of the challenges that we oftentimes experience from parents is when we say that their kid has ADHD, and then they're like, well, my kid's not like that at home. So I want to see that. I want to see what is it about their home environment that might be different from school or from other places. And so we conduct our intake, which is just a really long interview that asks a whole bunch of questions about the kid and the parent or parents. So we first do that. Then we have our first testing session with the kid. And what we always do is we would invite the parent to come in to observe the testing process, because we don't want that to be mystical in nature, that we're doing something weird to their kid and then they're just going to hand them these results and not really explain to them what it means, because we're trying to add context to what we might come up with in terms of a diagnosis. And so the parent is always able to see, these are the tests that we're giving the kid. Notice how he's behaving, he or she's behaving right now. You see how as the person is trying to administer the test, that the kid is all over the place or bouncing around and things like that. Or you see how the assessor interacted with the kid to get them to stop, right? So we want them to see both things. We want them to see whatever the challenges are. Then we also want them to see whatever the interventions are too, that we use to help the child. Then after we finish up all of the testing, we then sit down and have a really comprehensive review of the results with the parent before we write everything up. So the parent then has the opportunity to say, I'm not really sure what that means. So then when we go back and write the report up, we can write it in a way that makes sense for the parent. And then we have the feedback session for them, and then we give them the results. And so at every stage of the process, the parent is first given the opportunity to provide a different, given the opportunity for us to see the kid in a variety of different ways, which helps to dispute any sort of, well, my kid's not like this at home, or my kid's only like that at school, some along those lines. It allows us to demystify the testing process because the parent is involved in it and is able to see what's going on with their child during the testing. And then they're also involved in the feedback session where they're able to provide information about how they think the kid was different or how they're experiencing the results to see if they understand. And I think those are the ways that we have to address that potential stigma there, or to help educate parents better.
Okay, so tell me in what percentage you actually think that happens. That wonderful scenario.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you administer that. But what percent of kids actually go through that process?
Well, any kid that comes to us will always go through that. And that's what the science says is the best way to engage in the testing process. In order to make a diagnosis of ADHD now, no matter what type of process that you use, you always have to have observation during the testing process and then at school, because you have to be able to say that the kid is experiencing ADHD symptoms in at least 2 different places. So some of that has to occur.
But maybe not all.
But not always.
Okay. And so when you say, if you come to us, who is us?
Who is us? So the Center for Behavioral Health at Spalding. That's how we do our testing process. So we're not able to go into the homes per se, but we always go to schools and we always do a school observation. And then we always make sure the parents are involved in the feedback session as well. Oftentimes when parents get reports nowadays, their kid is just kind of whisked away and does some tests, and then they're mailed a report, and then that's it. And that's not a very helpful way for parents to get information, because these tests and these reports are like real long sometimes, and they say a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think if nothing else, you have to be able to sit down with the parent and to give them some good feedback about their kid, and to be patient enough to answer any questions that they have.
Do you have the option with JCPS, do you have the option with schools to say, I don't want this particular person assessing my child, I want somebody else assessing my child? Do you have that option?
Yeah, as a parent, you always have a choice. The school will provide you someone, and oftentimes that person is free because they work for the school. And so I think if there's a financial barrier, that can pose a challenge for parents in terms of access to choice. But I know at Spalding, at the Center for Behavioral Health, we offer reduced fees for assessments. And so our fees are much, much less compared to a lot of the testing places around town. In terms of being able to offer the same quality of service if you are trying to find someone outside the JCPS system.
Okay, can you tell me what those fees are?
Sure. So it ranges from $600 if you make a lot of money, all the way down to $250 if you don't make a lot of money. And our $600 fee is about half of what you would pay, is a little less than half, a little more than half of what you would pay out in the community, because the average testing out in the community is about $1,300 to $1,500.
Okay. The next one, suicide.
Mm-hmm.
I want to discuss black male suicides, because when I was doing my research, it was like astronomical. It was looking at, I think I looked at maybe 1,796, and what it was showing, this correlation was between female suicides and male suicides and the methods of suicide, and it said overall suicide 57% are gun related.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and they felt like, and I want you to answer this, or substantiate it, or say, no, that's not true, that they felt like teen suicide in the African American community seemed to heighten due to drugs and easy access to guns.
Mm.
So I want you to speak to that.
Sure. Just a little background information. You are right.
Mm-hmm.
Suicide is on the rise for teens. So right now, suicide is the third leading cause of death for teens ages 15 to 18. It is also the third leading cause of death for our youngest kids between the ages of 6 and 12. There was a study that was done that came out last year that said that there has been 1,500 kids that have committed suicide in the last decade between the ages of 6 and 12. And of that number, 36% of them were black males. So there's certainly something going on within our community that is contributing to the experience of hopelessness and sadness that is then leading to suicide. Women still typically attempt suicide more than men, but men complete suicide at higher rates. And the reason why it happens is because they engage in more lethal means to do so. So they're more likely to use weapons, firearms, etc., which contributes to the more completion rates. I do not think that accessibility and drugs are what's fueling the higher suicide rates for black males. I think we're living in a space now where more black males feel hopeless and sad and have no way to express it except for through frustration and anger that starts out outward and then goes inward, which then contributes to them wanting to harm themselves and ultimately end their lives.
I was surprised to read that it said that with suicide, the most predominant reason in teens. One was relationships. And it went on to say isolation. Isolation from school, isolation from church, family, the things where they would get the support. And talk about teen relationships a little bit.
Sure.
And that seemed to be the predominant reason. And that kind of surprised me. But
Yeah, so in high school is a testing time for teens. It's their opportunity to find out what they like about relationships, what they don't like about relationships, how to develop their social skills to be the best in relationships, whether they be romantic or friendship. And so they're really like trying out all of those skills. Another thing is that teen relationships are very intense. So you might date someone for 2 weeks, but it feels like it was 2 years in terms of the level of intensity of that relationship. And so teens take the ending of relationships very hard, and oftentimes don't have the support and the social skills to be able to process that particular part of their experience. And so they are trying out all these new relationship skills. They find those relationship skills don't give them what they're looking for in terms of a positive relationship. They feel intensely about that relationship. They then reach out to maybe either their peers or to older folks. Older folks tell them, hey, 2 weeks is not 2 years. You need to tone it down some. They don't receive that well. They reach out to their peers who tell them something opposite. And then they're left torn, in this space of like, well, how should I feel about this relationship that ended? And then I have no way to deal with it because I have no one to talk to. And so then they isolate themselves, which is not something that teens want to do, especially in today's time, because social media is so prevalent. And so when they don't do those things, that's when those feelings of sadness arise. And then they feel hopeless.
do you think that females identify themselves more with relationships in their definition of self than men?
I think they're socialized to think that way. I think we all come into this world wanting to connect with other people. I think we promote that skill more in females compared to males. And so if you think about even what our play looks like, as young folks, we have women, we have females play doll, play house, do all those things that have a more relational component to it. Whereas with boys, we socialize them to play sports or to build things or things like that don't require the same type of relational skill set. And so I think in some ways we just socialize our young ladies to be socialized to engage in more relationships.
They're counting me down.
Okay.
So we're going to pause and then we're going to come back very shortly with part 2 of this intriguing series on mental health and Black teens. It is our efforts plus God's grace. We'll be back shortly.